Let me begin by welcoming you. What a joy it is to welcome all of you to HTI's 2022 Book Prize Lecture. This is a very special event because the HTI community is able to showcase, celebrate, and take pride in another graduate's contribution to the larger landscape of theological and religious education. Today, those of us in person and those online have the great pleasure to hear not one book prize winner, but two. Allow me a few seconds to share with you some background information about the book prize, and then Vanessa Rios Valentin, HTI Assistant Program Director, will introduce these scholars. The HTI Book Prize started in 2002 with the main objective of highlighting the work of Latin scholars in the areas of theology and religion. The award recognizes and rewards the best book written by a pre-tenured Latin scholar on theology and/or religion each year. Its immediate and long-term goals are to present models that will inspire further contributions by Latin scholars, to help leverage tenure for pre-tenured scholars, recognize and reward and publicize the prize-winning book written by Latin pre-tenured scholar on theological and religious education, and encourage scholars in the broader landscape to make these monograms a required and/or recommended reading in their courses. HTI Book Prize winners receive a financial prize and give an open lecture on their book during HTI's annual Professional Development Conference at Princeton Theological Seminary. The lecture will be followed by a book signing reception sponsored by HTI, and I'll tell you these books are greatly reduced, so I highly encourage you to buy them here and now. The past winners include some of the leading voices in Latin scholarship in the United States, and we are privileged to have some of them among us, which is Dr. Miguel Diaz, Dr. Benjamin Valentin, Michelle Gonzalez, Arlene Sanchez Walsh, Ralph Gomez Ruiz, now a president of a Catholic institution, David Sanchez, deceased, Michael Lee, Sammy Alfaro, Nestor Medina, Julian Gonzalez, Patrick Reyes, Peter Medina, Tito Madrazo, Tony Alonso, and Jonathan Calvino. Thank you for being with us this evening, and we wish you an edifying time. And now, Vanessa, will you introduce our 2022 Book Prize winners?
Good evening, everyone. Oh, that did not sound like a good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. We are so excited tonight to be here celebrating our this year's book prize winners, Dr. Yara Gonzalez Justiniano, and our very own Dr. Joao Chavez. We do want to emphasize both HTI graduates, so we have to be HTI proud. Tonight we will begin with hearing about Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano's winning book titled Centering Hope as a Sustainable Decolonial Practice, Esperanza en Práctica, published by Lexington Books. Then we will continue with Dr. Joao Chavez's winning book titled Migrational Religion, Context and Creativity in the Latinx Diaspora, published by Baylor University Press. After both books have been presented, we will open up for questions. Additionally, for anyone who is interested in purchasing either of these books, they will be available outside for purchase. Please, cash or checks only. And in addition to that, feel free to approach our book prize winners for book dedications. So definitely go purchase your books and come find them. Before we begin, let's share some highlights about tonight's presenters. We're going to start with Dr. Yara Gonzalez Justiniano, who is an assistant professor of religion, culture, and psychology with an emphasis in Latinx studies at Vanderbilt University. She is also affiliated faculty of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies. She received a PhD in theological studies with a concentration in church and society from Boston University School of Theology, where she also received her Master's of Divinity. At the University of Puerto Rico, hey! Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano earned a BA in Audiovisual Communications with a concentration on film. Prior to joining the Vanderbilt Divinity faculty, Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano was visiting assistant professor at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary as a Louisville postdoctoral fellow. She also served as Doctor of Ministry Program Tract Advisor for the students in the Preaching and Leadership in Latinx congregations. Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano serves in the status of Racial and Ethnic Minorities in the Profession Committee of the American Academy of Religion and is Secretary-Treasurer of the Association of Practical Theology. She is also currently under the care in ordination process with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the New England region. Responding to Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano's book tonight is our very own, also HTI graduate, Dr. Teresa Delgado. Dr. Teresa Delgado is Dean at St. John's University College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, as well as Professor of Theology and Religious Studies. She received her doctorate from Union Theological Seminary in New York City under the guidance of the trailblazing womanist theologian, Dr. Dolores S. Williams. She has published on various topics, including her essays titled Metaphor for Preaching, Good Teaching is Like Good Sex, and Beyond Procreativity, Heterosexuals Queering Marriage in Queer Christianities. Dr. Delgado authored the book titled A Puerto Rican Decolonial Theology, Prophecy, Freedom, as well as co-authored For the Beauty of the World, The Moral Imaginary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s World House. And of course, we can't forget her poetry, Summer Solstice, which is included in the collection titled Unruly Catholic Feminist, Prose, Poetry, and the Future of the Faith. Addressing the needs for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion for higher education, Dr. Delgado mentors doctoral students of color to nurture their success in the academy, the world, and the church. As Senior Fellow of the Ford Foundation, she has served on the board of HTI, a member of the Mentoring Consortium of the Forum for Theological Exploration, and the Advisory Committee of the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion. Dr. Delgado served as president of the board of Westchester People's Action Coalition, a leading force of social justice activism in Westchester County, New York, and currently serves as a member of the Board of Trustees of Colgate University and the Ursuline School. Please, let's give a great welcome to Dr. Yara Gonzalez Justiniano and Dr. Teresa Delgado.
Buenas noches, good evening everyone. Whew. I'm looking at, I can't touch this. Oh, I can, I changed it. Okay, is it okay? I wanted to see who's logged in because I see my dad. Mi mamá dice que uno no puede repicar campana, pasar el cepillo y dar misa. My mom says that you can't ring the bell, take the offering, and say the sermon. And I tell her, yes, you can, because everything happens at a different time. But it's only possible because of the work that we do in community, the work that I do in community. So I'm currently teaching at the Hispanic Summer Program, and they're doing a watch party. I just flew in from there and we'll fly out tomorrow again. And it's because of the support of places like HSP and HTI that I am here. Absolutely. And also the support of my family, who's also here. So I am going to read the first paragraph of acknowledgments in both Spanish and English, because I'm hoping that they listen to me and my grandma is watching. So, cuando la oficina del correo abrió en Puerto Rico 2 semanas después del huracán, yo empecé a enviar cajas llenas de cosas para mi familia, los vecinos y a quien sea que pudiera alcanzar. When the post office opened in Puerto Rico about 2 weeks after the hurricane, I started sending boxes filled with supplies for family, their neighbors, and whomever I could reach. Solamente las personas que tenían P.O. Box podían recibir cartas. Así que la gente se volvió un centro de distribución entre las personas. Only people with P.O. Box, post office boxes could receive mail, so people who had them became the contact for distribution. Yo llamé a mi madrina, quien milagrosamente tenía señal, para dejarle saber sobre las cajas que ya había enviado con cargadores solares, batería, filtros de agua, etc. I called my madrina, my godmother, who miraculously had reception, to let her know about the boxes I had shipped with solar charges, batteries, water filters, etc. Y antes de enganchar, ella me dijo, tú eres nuestra esperanza, y después enganchó. And before hanging up, she said to me, you are our hope, and then hung up. Estas palabras se han quedado conmigo de una manera poderosa hasta este día. These words haunt me in a powerful way to this day. Yo estaba en una posición de servirle a mi familia porque otros me habían servido y me permitieron proveer. I was in a position to serve my family because others had served me and enabled me to provide. Ella, sin embargo, no se estaba refiriendo a lo que significaba para ella esperar las cajas que iban de camino y tampoco estaba poniendo sobre mí el peso de cumplir sus esperanzas. She, however, was not referring to what it means for her to wait for the boxes, no putting the burden on my shoulders to fulfill her hopes. Ella me estaba diciendo que yo era la esperanza de ella desde el momento que ella supo que yo venía a este mundo. She was telling me that I had been their hope since the moment they learned I was on my way into this world. Ella se refería a las formas en las que me habían criado y me habían nutrido en la esperanza de que algún día yo iba a poder dar cara a la lucha en solidaridad con otros. She was referring to the ways I had been raised and nurtured in the hopes that I would be ready to face the daily trials and struggles in solidarity with others. Yo era su esperanza porque I was their hope. Let me read this in English first. I was their hope because I was moved to be the one they had raised in hope. Yo era su esperanza porque me moví a ser quien ellos criaron ser. This work is the birthing of the hope of my family, my loved ones, and my faith sowed. Este es el trabajo que nace de la esperanza de mi familia, mis seres queridos, y que la fe hizo crecer. So I teach some of the things that I learned from this work. My question was, where is the hope and what does it look like? And I wanted to touch it. I was like, it has to be somewhere that you can find it and see it in ways that are material. And this question was actually born after reading some of Delgado's work around Puerto Rico and being asked the question, where's the hope in a classroom? And I said, well, no hay. And so that stuck with me because I know there is. So the work is focused on Hurricane Maria because when I was writing, so this is my dissertation, which is also a product of HTI because Uli's hands are here and Catherine's hands are here. So the guided me to do ethnographic research and ask the communities, where's your hope? What does it look like? Can you touch it? And it just so happened that when I didn't have hope, then Hurricane Maria hit, and it's like it really helped it to really show, right, if there was or there wasn't. It was kind of a particular unveiling. So it's not easy, but it's more comfortable for me to teach the book than to read from it. And when I asked my students yesterday, what should I tell you all, as the gist of the book, she said, well, read the stories. Talk about your mom. And so I'm going to try to do that. On the night of September 19, 2017, I was on the phone with my mother in Puerto Rico, going through our hurricane preparedness checklist. She said she left me and that she was going to hacer el rosario, pray the rosary, and then go to bed. From my place in Boston, I figured the only way I could be with her was by praying the rosary at the same time. The mysteries that day were los misterios dolorosos, the sorrowful mysteries. Sometimes I did not know to which Maria I was praying. Maria passed through an island that was already only holding on to its loincloth and was left naked. As the cyclone roared with the force of a tornado, threatened to blow open doors, windows, and in many homes devastatingly succeeding, my sister replayed in her mind an emergency exit strategy. If she put the smaller dog on her back, she could with one arm grab the larger dog and with the other hold on to my mother as they ran out for safety, assuming there would be any safety to be found, but she couldn't plan that far ahead. Sadly, the hurricane was only the beginning. So this was the part that the student said, talk about your mother. As we were on a conversation, so as Hurricane Maria became a marker in Puerto Rican history, Puerto Rico might be stuck on the sorrowful mysteries for a very long time, but that doesn't mean it does not continue to move forward like the rosary, bead by bead. November 19, 2017, commemorated the island's discovery by Spain 524 years previous. That was the day that I was talking to my mom. And in the Catholic Church, it is also the day of the patron of the Virgin of Puerto Rico, La Virgen de la Providencia, the Virgin of Providence. This date also marked 2 months after the hurricane. Offering a glimpse of the historical and theological complexities of coloniality, my mother called me on that morning of the 19th to remind me of how Maria, La Virgen, gave us Jesus, the embodiment of the divine providence. Jesus is with us and in us, and when Jesus is with us, we show up. Los buenos somos más, she reminded me. People are showing up, and we are rising together. This was the first time my mom had cried with me after Maria. Paradoxically, the realization of hope was what finally allowed her to break down in tears. To claim with the wisdom of Puerto Rican folk knowledge that there is no evil that lasts 100 years, nor a body that can endure it. No hay mal que dure 100 años, ni cuerpo que lo resista, is no naive confession of the eradication of evil. Rather, the statement is catalytic, compelling us to imagine that evil is not all there is, and that a flourishing future is possible. So, I have the little, do you have the? Something will pop up. That we're waiting for. So this is, as I was writing and gathering this right here is my mom. So as I was gathering the data and reading and listening to people's stories, I really got into the stories and then remember that I had to do something constructive with it and show something to the academy. And the last thing I did was write a definition of hope because I forgot that I should have written a definition of hope. So this right here is simple circle. And so why hope is at the center, and I'll read you the quote that is much better articulated. Hope being at the center and the ways that I'm trying to imagine it, especially as a sustainable hope and the ways that I wanted to look at it, was how can I talk about hope in a neutral way in the sense that I can find what the atom is. So hope is made out of absence, promise, imagination, and trust. And all these things happening in different quantities. The circle just So this, so this is the way that we organize hope, and the way that we organize hope is impacted by our culture, our language, our geography, our politics, our economics, and they're all impacting and moving hope and shaping it and shaping what is absent, shaping the way and what we trust in, shaping what promise looks like, and shaping the ways that we can or cannot imagine. So what hope does is just breaks through all these other things, because it's the thing that is letting us know that there's something there, that there's something more, and that reality is not the exhaustion of all possibilities. So if you know me or have talked to me at least for 10 minutes, you know that the love of my life is my sister. And when I was little, I always said that I was going to write books and she was going to illustrate them. And Dean Reyes, yes, the children's books are coming. And so I gave her the book, and she saw this, and then she drew this. So in the ways that through the window, right, we can imagine what for her would be the hope, the thing that is out there, and that we can see that what we're moving towards, what lies ahead, can respond to the needs of our present, but also does not have to be exactly the same. And so I will end with 2 quotes, constructive piece. There is no one way to practice hope. The practice of hope takes the shape of what it needs: education, political and civic participation, community building, resistance, and survival. It is the guts that makes the heart. De tripas corazones. For Walter Fluker and Rubem Alves, hope is born out of the acknowledgement of the tragic character of human existence, yet it refuses to give up. Or as the Spanish expression goes, armarse de valor. Valor translates as both value and courage. This expression encourages its hearers to prepare themselves and take risks. I am not very keen on military language, but to be in la lucha is also to fight, to continue pushing against something that is pushing against you. Clothing yourself with courage and value in the context of decolonial practices of hope means to remember your value and your sense of agency. A decolonial practice of hope necessitates community to piece the memories together and to enact agency when others might not have it. It is a communal empuje, push, thrust, that dives into and calls out from the void with a hope that a new creation will emerge. So as I said at the beginning, when I set out to research this book, my main questions were, what is the hope? Where is it? What does it look like? So I have isolated the concept of hope, but hope does not work alone. The thematic movement of each chapter, as I put them as context, hope, practice, imagination, and telos, aim, had led me to a model of hope constructed by the hope I found in ecclesial practices, but appeared to foster society's flourishing through solidarity and compassion. As one of my collaborators said, even if the institutional churches are depleted, del pueblo mismo van a surgir las experiencias de fe que va a hacer que la iglesia continúe. From the people themselves, the experiences of faith are going to rise, and that's what's going to make the church continue. Hope persists and transcends current structures, especially when these are no longer fostering liberation. Although the church is an institutional component of organization, the way that we organize life, still serves a purpose in Puerto Rico, Hope does not exist because of the institution itself, but because of the people who nurture it, or do not. Theologians like Leonardo Boff have followed their hopes outside of the Christian church and beyond mainline religious institutions. After leaving the Franciscan order, Boff wrote that he would continue on his path of hope, saying, "I have changed, not the battle itself, but the trenches from which I shall fight." The challenge of sustainable hope is to unearth what is at stake and build practices that will sustain a dignified life for all creation. The challenge to the institutional church is to listen to the faith that emerges from the people, not only to stay relevant, but so it can continue to be hope. Más largo que la esperanza del pobre, this is the title of this chapter, centers the power of hope on those who are at the margins, those who know what is missing. A recipe that centers the hopes of the margins to foster something that can sustain people's lives and nurtures flourishing requires imagining that there is something beyond what our circumstances reveal and breaks through the concrete that is suffocating what lies beneath. Hope is an ontological virtue that predisposes an expectation of the future. It is our walk and both our weight on the things that have yet to materialize. It projects that which is yet to happen. A sustainable hope provides the means to materialize a hope in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. We now welcome Dr. Teresa Delgado.
I'd like to begin where Yara pointed us to, which is a quote right after the acknowledgments in her book. Hope is knowing that reality is not the exhaustion of all possibilities. It is an absolute pleasure to be here tonight as we celebrate and honor these incredible projects, these books that have been so meaningful, and for me to be responding to Yara's work. In my role as Yara's HTI mentor and a second reader of her dissertation, it was an honor to work with her as she completed the timely ethnographic project, which was titled at that time in its dissertation iteration, Hope in Practice, Public Presence of the Church in Puerto Rico, which led to this publication. It's been a privilege to accompany Yara throughout the journey of her doctoral program and the fruition of all of her efforts in this well-conceived, comprehensive, interdisciplinary, and by all means necessary project. Given the condition of Puerto Rico and its devastation over the past decade, but not to mention its colonial status of the last century in relation to the United States. Yara's study, as she has mentioned, tracks the practices that embody and enact hope, particularly those operating on the periphery of the official churches. She seeks a viable response to how the church can and does, or doesn't, participate in public practices that inspire a hopeful future. Given, as I mentioned, the debt crisis, the effects of major hurricanes, the mass migration from the island, the economic despair, and a global pandemic, to name but a few of the looming and interwoven problems facing Puerto Rico, Yara's project acknowledges two main foci. One, the people of Puerto Rico want and desperately need sources of hope to address these multiple dilemmas. And two, the church has been a location where hope has been sought, maybe not necessarily found, but certainly sought. Yara explores whether the people have found the hope they are seeking within the institutional church and whether that hope is practiced and sustainable. Her study and the intention behind it is deeply pastoral and practical in that its central concern is how a people can thrive in the midst of conditions, historical, environmental, theological, and psychological, that thwart such thriving. Perhaps the most painstaking aspect of Giada's project was in her interdisciplinary and ethnographic methodology, because she wanted to get it right, and I believe she did. That is, she sought to maintain the crucial balance of pointed research in the field of theology while stretching the boundaries of that field to address the topic substantively. This approach, along with centering the experiences of Puerto Rican women in the local church and community, reflect her commitment to decolonial methodologies that privilege the subaltern voices on the fringes of ecclesial and theological structures. Her project also makes room for further expansion to additional locales and denominations. Her research interests have a natural trajectory into the future. Perhaps it goes without saying, but I'll mention it anyway, that Giada's personal commitment to engaging across boundaries of language, culture, and history as a Puerto Rican woman born but now living in the diaspora was absolutely essential to this project. I witnessed personally every fiber of her being traumatized by the impact of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which dealt a body blow that brought her to her knees. Rather than succumb to despair, Giada harnessed all the strength she could muster to pour herself into her studies, as challenging as that was during that time. She was, as she mentioned, concerned about family and friends. She was sending packages and organizing collections. She was petitioning to the administration for student and staff support. She was doing all of these things through tears and in solidarity with the Puerto Rican diaspora, feeling the travail of a devastated island and people in her very body. In this moment, she understood in a deep and embodied way as never before the anguish of displacement and the necessity of engaging across boundaries within a colonial context. This is the spirit with which Giada approached the writing of this book, grounded in an enduring passion for justice by exploding sanctioned notions of colonialism, empire, race, and diaspora, the central axis around which her current project and her theological sensibilities revolve. In addition to the context of its writing, the content of this work is extremely important for the Puerto Rican Christian church and beyond. Indeed, any church community that is seeking to address suffering and hopelessness. There are very few studies that center the voices and experiences of Puerto Rican people to identify life-giving and life-sustaining ecclesial practices. Giada does just that, and with such creativity, by weaving multiple interdisciplinary threads to make a distinct contribution to constructive theology and practical theology. This is the strongest contribution of this manuscript, its creative development of a new way to see the hope that is present in marginalized communities so that these can be supported and amplified by those who are in positions of pastoral ministry. Rather than, for example, being overlooked because they may not fit a predetermined model of what hope should look like. One of Giada's many strengths is her ability to utilize sources in English and Spanish, bridging a significant divide between Puerto Rican island and diaspora scholars who may be fluent in one tradition or the other. By traversing multiple languages and multiple disciplines within those languages, Giada establishes a robust foundation for the constructive theological work developed in the later chapters. And I absolutely love the inclusion of Puerto Rican folk sayings as a discursive frame for each chapter. Giada strikes an elegant balance of the more technical language of the discipline with the very powerful interjection of personal narrative to amplify that content. Her intentionality about writing for a broader audience is evident, because even the more abstract concepts in chapter 2, for example, are explored in an accessible manner without sacrificing the rigor of the argument. The visual representation of the models at the end of the book are another strength of this manuscript and quite powerful depictions of the narrative. They are central to an understanding of hope as an axis, which can be depicted and thus practiced in multiple ways. And since there are relatively few theological works that center Puerto Rican voices, and the audience of this work will be scholars in the US, it was essential to begin with the contextual piece, as many people, even now, don't know about the history of Puerto Rico. In a survey conducted after Hurricane Maria, approximately 53% of the US population didn't know that Puerto Ricans are US citizens. To that point, in November 1993, Puerto Rican author Esmeralda Santiago penned an op-ed piece in the New York Times titled Island of Lost Causes, commenting on the impending referendum that year to vote for one of the three options at the heart of most Puerto Rican political arguments: independence, statehood, or status quo. Santiago offered a stinging indictment when she says, quote, "We are taken for granted by the US, and that sharpens in us a stubborn nationalist streak. Yet we won't demonstrate it at the ballot box. In our hearts, we want to believe independence is the right choice, but our history forces us to see it as a lost cause," unquote. In other words, hopeless. I would argue that Jara's work helps us to see a way through the hopelessness, not by pretending it doesn't exist, but by situating oneself precisely in the place where hopelessness and hope exist, side by side, and that is the Christian ecclesial community. Where else but at the axis of the cross and the resurrection can we be situated in hopelessness that can generate hope? I've been thinking a great deal these days about hopelessness and hope, about death and the miraculous. As many of you know, my beloved Pascal, my spouse of 35 years, with whom I've shared my life and my love for nearly 4 decades, and the loving father of our 4 children, passed away exactly 3 weeks ago today. In my eulogy to him last Tuesday, I reflected on the fact that many gathered in the church, myself included, prayed unceasingly for a miracle, that the disease that had enveloped his body would disappear and he would be restored to the fullness of health. And I acknowledge some who might think that his death disproved the miraculous at work in his life. And yet, I believe that we can, in fact, we must, as Christians, hold together the mystery of death and the miraculous. The cross and the resurrection proclaim that for us. And if a miracle is understood as divine intervention that defies the laws of nature, of hope that pierces hopelessness, then Pascal's life for the past 4 years that he endured this disease was indeed a miracle. That he was able to laugh and love, to dance and play while undergoing brutal chemo treatments was a miracle. That he could hold on to life, to witness his daughter's graduation from law school the day before he died, was a miracle. That even when his body was broken and fading, he lifted up countless others, was a miracle. That in the midst of excruciating pain for so long, he died painlessly and in peace, surrounded by the love of his children who gently ushered him into eternal life, just as he had ushered them into their life on this earth. That was a miracle. I want to acknowledge the existence of miracles, of breathing hope into lost causes, embodied by those who give of themselves lovingly, unconditionally for others, as Pascal did, of holding death and the miraculous together, of holding hopelessness and hope together. And hopelessness and death do not have the final say. This work carries that message and is crucial for the Puerto Rican Christian Church, indeed any community seeking to address suffering and hopelessness by centering life-giving and life-sustaining ecclesial practices. Yara does this so creatively, so accessibly, weaving multiple interdisciplinary threads to make that distinct contribution to constructive and practical theology. Her book represents a new way to see the hope that is present in marginalized, colonized communities in the most hopeless of circumstances, so that hope can be amplified by those in ministry, by those in power, by those of us. This is a book about hope and life, which can only flourish through sustained practices of decolonial action and activism. And I'll end with her words. Hope is knowing that reality is not the exhaustion of all possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano and Dr. Delgado, for your presentations. Thank you. We now continue with our second prize winner, Dr. Joao, and I'm going to share some of his highlights. Dr. Joao, who is the Associate Director of Programming here at our beloved HTI, and Assistant Professor of Evangelicalism and Mission at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Before joining HTI in 2020, Dr. Chavez was a lecturer at the Baptist University of the Americas, where he taught for 6 years, and CEO of JJRC Enterprises. In the fall of 2023, he will join the faculty of the Department of Religion at Baylor University as the Assistant Professor of the History of Religion in the Americas. He will also hold an appointment in Baylor's graduate faculty. Dr. Chavez's research and teaching focus is on the history of Christianity in the Americas, the influence of U.S. Protestantism in Latin America, and the development of Latin American Latinx religious networks in the U.S. In addition to his prize-winning book, he has authored The Global Mission of Jim Crow South, Southern Baptist Missionaries and the Shaping of Latin American Evangelicalism, and his forthcoming book titled Remembering Antonia Teixeira, A Story of Missions, Violence, and Institutional Hypocrisy, which is co-authored with Dr. Michael Parsons. His peer-reviewed articles appear in several academic journals, such as the International Journal of Latin American Religions, the Journal of Reformed Theology, Political Theology Review, and Expositor Perspectives in Religious Studies, and Baptist History and Heritage. Additionally, Dr. Chavez has written opinion pieces about the history of Christianity in Latin America for periodicals and magazines, including the Washington Post and the Christian Century. He serves on the editorial board of Perspectives in Religious Studies and as co-editor of the Perspectives on Baptist Identities manuscript series published by Mercer University Press. With Dr. Raimundo Barreto and Dr. Erika Ramirez, Dr. Chavez is researching the connection between Christian nationalisms in Brazil and the U.S. The preliminary findings of this ongoing research will be presented at the upcoming 2023 faculty seminar at the Institute of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. Responding to Dr. Chavez tonight this evening is Dr. Heath W. Carter, who is Director of PhD Studies and Associate Professor of American Christianities here at Princeton Theological Seminary, where he teaches and writes about the intersection of Christianity and the American public life. He earned a BA in English and Theology from Georgetown University, an MA from the University of Chicago Divinity School, and a PhD in History from the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Carter came to Princeton from Valparaiso University, where he was on faculty from 2012 to 2019, and also served as the William S. Bond Visiting Fellow at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Carter is also the co-editor with Catherine Jin Lum and Mark Knoll of Erdman's award-winning Library of Religious Biology series, the senior co-editor of the Journal of Presbyterian History, and a member of the Louisville Institute's advisory board. Please help us welcome Dr. Joao Chavez and Dr. Heath Carter.
Very much, Jada, and Teresa, for this inspiring talk. I don't know how you follow that. Thank you so much for your work. I want to thank also the HTI and the Book Prize Selection Committee for this honor, although I was not involved in discussion of decisions with the selection committee, I promise. From this past year, I have been in previous years, and I know, I've listened to those conversations before, and I know that those decisions are not made lightly, so especially given the people in our networks that continue to write excellent books. So I appreciate that. The selection committee, thank you so much. And also, I want to thank Dr. Heath Carter for responding to my work. I have appreciated Dr. Carter's work for a while, but the day we met in person was special in your backyard, mixing up caipirinhas, and after we had just the right amount of them, we were FaceTiming with his mother-in-law speaking Portuguese and concocting when we would go hang out in Brazil. We need to finish that conversation. And of course, it's a pleasure to be here with Jada, who overlapped in our HCI journey, and also with all the book prize winners who are here. Miguel Diaz was the inaugural winner of the book prize. Dr. Benjamin Valentin is here too, and Dr. Patrick Reyes, among others who won this book. So we have a short time, and I just like to set the broad context of the book and talk about some sources, maybe some research methodologies, and offer a few main points of the book. So I'm going to just jump right in and do that. Right, so many have heard that Christianity's center of gravity already moved to the global south. And most Christians today are in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we can see this in the top 10 countries with the larger numbers of Christians in the world. In 2060, when it comes to global north countries, only the US is projected to be on that list. At the very top, following the US, is Brazil, which counts roughly with half the area and half the population of South America, the largest Catholic and Pentecostal populations in the world. And despite what you may hear from the Argentinians around here, and not unimportantly, the best national soccer team of all time. And of course, this high number of Christians in the U.S. is informed by the fact that it's one of the most popular destinations for Christian immigrants worldwide. The foreign-born population in the U.S. is the highest in number than it has ever been, almost the highest in percentage. And those numbers are, of course, projected to increase. In addition to those numbers, although by no means a complete overlap, there's the connected growth of the Latino population, which again, although not fully explained by migration dynamics, share a connection. So these dynamics touch the ground in different ways, and faith communities are vital for immigrants. I believe that in this group, I do not have to argue that point. And here's an example from Austin, Texas, that take my office at Austin Seminary, and I know that my dean is there watching from HSP, and I already gave my key back, Dr. Amer, but I'm counting as my office still, given that I have 3 more days with Austin Seminary. And it takes my office there at Austin Seminary as a central point and looks at immigrant congregations within a 20-mile radius. And I think you could reproduce this in any major city in the US. And here's how things look in Austin. So this is Austin Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary there. We have Chinese congregations, Ethiopian, Indian, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and drum roll, Latino churches, and those are primarily Spanish and Portuguese speaking churches. So migrational religion looks at a slice of that. A lot of the churches led by Latin American immigrants, particularly looks at Brazilian Baptist immigrant churches, which I call Brazuca churches in the book. And Brazuca, as you already hear my Brazuca friends here perhaps laughing, is a name that Brazilian immigrants often refer to each other. So the book narrates a history of this group paying closer attention to how migration experiences and the U.S. context affect faith communities and individuals, taking into consideration the historical connections shared by the largest non-Pentecostal Protestant denomination in Brazil, the Brazilian Baptist Convention, and the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., the Southern Baptist Convention. Connections that take new transnational manifestations in immigrant churches. So there is a close historical affinity between those immigrant churches and the Southern Baptist Convention. However, as I argue in the book, the closer Brazilian Baptists get to the Southern Baptist Convention geographically, the further they get from them theologically. The struggles of immigrant living help account for this distancing. And I did archival work, archival research in 11 churches in several states like California, Florida, Texas, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and Maryland, as well as Washington, D.C. I look at church minutes, local ethnic newspapers, Sunday school materials, sermons, among other things, and also interviewed several pastors. So that's kind of the general context of the study. So I'm going to just pinpoint a few major points of these communities, and then we can just hear Dr. Carter's response. So in terms of main points, the first thing I would say is a new place or a shift in place in the U.S. Latin American, or of the U.S. in Latin American evangelicalism, and I say as somebody who came out of the tradition, ex-evangelical, as some people called, so it's in a place that continues to shift, right? So when missionaries arrived in Brazil in 1881, being welcomed by Confederate exiles who had migrated to Brazil partially because Brazil remained a slaveholding country until 1888, that is 23 years after the American Civil War ended. So these migrants who probably never imagined how things would progress. And so 100 years later, in 1981, a Brazilian pastor came as a missionary to a church founded by Germans in the late 1800s, but which was now surrounded by Portuguese immigrants, and asking the Brazilians to come and try to recruit Portuguese in those, the Iberian Portuguese in those communities to that church. That church is actually not too far from here, it's in Newark. And so this is what the pastor said at his inauguration. Right? Walnut Street Baptist Church, after a century of its organization, and coincidentally, a century after the arrival of the first Baptist missionaries in Brazil, opened its doors under the leadership of a Brazilian Baptist pastor for the sake of the evangelization of the millions of Portuguese people living in the United States. Anti-Catholic biases were never too hard to be found among Baptists, although the case of Latin America is a little bit complex. given that there was many or much anti-Protestant violence also, as some of you might know. So those, you can hear that because when they talk about Portuguese, they're talking about recruiting Catholics to become Protestant. So after 40 years later, over 100 Brazilian churches cater to Portuguese-speaking, Spanish-speaking, and English-speaking Christians across the U.S. as they diversify their base. Well, the second important element that I will say regards missions, and I will not enter in discussions about the overlap between mission and colonialism, though I am aware or insensitive to them. My book, The Global Mission of the Jim Crow South, addresses some of those concerns as they relate to the same group. But I'd rather point out that people today speak about reverse missions, which is the notion that Christians worldwide who were recruited by Christians from countries in the global north are now coming back to recruit them. That is certainly happening, but a closer look at the history of missions show that missions have more often been multi-directional, from everywhere to everywhere. And the Brazilian immigrant churches of these Brazuca churches certainly exemplify that. So soon after the Southern Baptist Convention sent the first missionaries to Brazil, Brazil began sending missionaries to places like Chile and Portugal. Then the Portuguese, who became Baptist via Brazilian interventions, came to the U.S. following the Portuguese migration of the early 1900s. Meanwhile, Brazilian Baptists continue expanding their missionary efforts, including sending missionaries to the U.S. As Brazilian immigrant churches were formed here, these churches began supporting and sending missionaries back to Brazil, to the Caribbean, to other Latin American countries, to Africa, and to Asia. But the immigrant struggles, or as I call sometimes in the book, the sense of unbelonging of Brazilian Baptists in the U.S., pushed them beyond the limits of the denomination with which they are more commonly associated here, which is the Southern Baptist Convention. Brazilians were not satisfied with the SBC and formed their own ethnic associations. Pastor joins the Order of Pastors of Brazil, and they tried to change the bylaws of the Brazilian Baptist Convention so that they will be part of that convention rather than the Southern Baptists here. And they argued that because the churches here will contribute in dollars, their contributions will be larger than that of many states in the country. But that did not work. And in addition to that, immigrant churches are also part of other transnational networks, such as the Global Kingdom Partnership Network, which it's influential in many ways in the Christian nationalist transnational networks that was mentioned in my bio. We're studying now with Dr. Raimundo Barreto, who is a professor here, and our colleague, Dr. Erica Ramirez, also. Another point that I'll make about that is major in the book also is the way in which the number of undocumented immigrants is also a factor that changes the identities of these churches. And I'll just read 3 testimonies from interviews here, actually 2, and then something that was printed in the bulletin, so they can have a sense of that. Again, I want you to read the book, so I'm not going to be exhaustive. So I'm just talking about a few things. So pastor number 1 that I'm going to quote here said this: "Today we have one man, this is our responses to interviews. Today we have one man who is arrested. Every week someone is arrested. What is our protocol? Our church has a lawyer. She is Brazilian. Any immigration case in which the church is involved, there is a lawyer. The lawyer enters the field, that's a soccer analogy. She's a Brazilian woman from Belo Horizonte, and she enters the field and solves it for the church." Another pastor said, "I have been solving this kind of problem for 25 years. 25 years seeing these immigration issues coming up, separation of families. The father is deported, the mother stays with the children, and then the family can't stay and have to go back to Brazil. But the kids are American citizens. And then when they turn 18, they want to come back to live here. We open the doors for them to return. So there is a whole cycle and story of immigration." So And then this pastor in the church bulletin here, I'll read real quickly, shows something interesting, and I'll read and then comment on it. So this was in a church bulletin of a church here in New Jersey, but I used several of them in the book, or at least either footnoted or quoted. And it says this: yesterday I was reading an article written by Gustavo Gutierrez about liberation theology, in which he analyzed the trajectory of the movement since its inception. Among a number of challenging things, the text calls us to act in a liberative fashion in all occasions of our walk in the world. This means that Christian practice must always come with the most absolute respect for the human being, and must compel us to act with the intention of liberating humans from any form of oppression to which they may be subjugated. In the church, acting in a liberative way is, among other things, fostering collective conscience of dignity and value in the members of the community, practicing tolerance toward the deviants, and this is a reference to undocumented parishioners, and avoiding any moves in gestures or verbally that diminish the other. So even in some cases, there is this creative engagement with liberation theology, which, as some of you who are familiar with the Latin American context know, is not necessarily popular among Protestant popular kind of expressions outside academic conversations. So you see that at a popular level, at the engagement, dealing with undocumented workers here or parishioners here, whereas if this pastor were to say this in a church in Brazil, he's probably going to get in trouble because, again, it's this disconnect where talk about Latin American liberation theology is very well accepted in academic conversations, but at a popular level, not necessarily so. Certainly not by groups like this. So, and the fact that the world is becoming more and more Pentecostal also affect these immigrant churches, right? Zimbabwe and Brazil are the two countries with the largest percentage of charismatics and Pentecostals in Brazil, with the number, like I mentioned, with the country with the largest number. And that means that Brazilian immigrants to the U.S. who are Pentecostals many times attend Baptist churches for many reasons. But primarily, as I show in the book, for ethnic solidarity trumps denomination or religious identity. So when it comes to women pastors, also I don't know how many of you follow the history of American Christianity or U.S. Protestantism, but we're just on the other side of the Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting, and you might see the brouhaha with I know there's a technical term, by the way, with Rick Warren and not accepting women pastors. But then these churches that are affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, nevertheless, without making much noise, have women leadership in much bigger percentage. And in the book, I make the argument that there are three things that kind of make that happen. It is Pentecostalization, financial independence, and an institutional, although the institutional connection is with the Southern Baptist Convention, there is a closer kind of affinity or a closer connection to some aspects of the Brazilian Baptist Convention, which does ordain women, although not in an uncontroversial way. So beyond these points, migration of religion, at least as I see it, and the most important thing that I hope it does, is telling a story of a group whose history is not often at the center of traditional academic interests in the U.S., and in this sense is well within the general trajectory of books written by many HTI scholars, especially the growing number of historians in our ranks, such as Felipe Hinojosas, in his work on Latino Mennonites and later the Young Lords, Daniel Ramirez, his work on Apostólico, Gaston Espinosa's work on Pentecostalism, Jorge Juan Rodriguez's work on religion and politics, and there are many more that could be mentioned. And although I'm very grateful for this prize and the HTI scholars who have already established pathway for others, I really look forward to what still lies ahead. The HTI historians are coming. And what lies ahead as far as HTI historians are concerned includes Danny Bellon's work on black and brown queer Pentecostals and evangelicals in the U.S., Guilherme de Souza's research on Brazilian Adventists, Stephanie Griswold's work on fundamentalist Mormonism in Mexico, Stephen De Troglio's work on Pentecostalism in Argentina. Thankfully, it's not soccer in Argentina. Leslie Garrote's research on race and gender in American Christianity, and on and on. They are all here, by the way. So being a part of this great cloud of witnesses that came before is an honor, certainly. But it brings great joy to me that this beautiful and complex community continues to nurture excellent scholarship, and the best is yet to come. And we are just beginning. Thank you.
All right. Good evening. Thank you to all my friends at HTI for the invitation to participate in the banquet this evening and for this celebration of these vital works of scholarship. It's truly an honor to be here with esteemed faculty colleagues and administrators and HTI scholars. I think, as you all know, it's a season of extraordinary challenge in the world of theological education. And in my view, HTI has been, for a long time now, one of the best things going in this world, and this warm community here tonight really testifies to that. I want to extend a special thanks at the outset to Vanessa Rios Valentin, who led the way on arranging my participation this evening, to Joanne Rodriguez for her warm collegiality here at Princeton Seminary, for her visionary leadership of HTI, and to Joao Chavez for writing this wonderful book and for the opportunity to speak a little bit about it tonight. I love that in Joao's presentation he shared just putting up here some of your sources and all, really underscoring the tremendous amount of research that is present in this book, both archival sources and interviews, and all of it really matters and all of it sheds new light. So I want to use my brief time this evening to frame what I see as some of the major achievements of migrational religion, the book's significance for scholars of religion in the Americas, among other fields, the ways that it opens a remarkable window onto worlds that stretch and are sustained across all kinds of boundaries, national and theological and denominational and more. But if you'll indulge me, I want just a brief personal note that Joao sort of alluded to by saying that the book offered me also new insight into my own family. As he well knows and mentioned, my mother-in-law is Brazilian, and through her, over the last 2+ decades, I've become connected to a whole world of Brazilians, family and friends, who have moved between many of the hubs of Brazuca life that you discuss in this book, Joao, Boston and South Florida and more, and as places were popping up, I was like, this makes so much sense to me. The folks that I know are for the most part not Baptists, and yet, like so many of the characters in Joao's story, they defy easy categorization as conservative or progressive and the like. Their religious and political lives are complex and unpredictable in so many of the ways that he highlights in this book. So as I was reading, I couldn't help but text photos of particular paragraphs and pages to my mother-in-law, Tanya, who typically doesn't have a lot of interest in academic books, but she was totally captivated by what I was sending her because these snippets really resonated deeply with her experience. When I talked to her yesterday on the phone, she told me that she was going to have to go out and buy a copy of the book for herself. So there you go, Joao. I mentioned at the outset that migrational religion offers a remarkable window onto boundary-crossing religious developments. Chavez opens that window in part through extensive historical digging. He traces the roots of contemporary Brazuca Baptist communities back to the years after the U.S. Civil War, when recently Confederate white Southern Baptists set off for Brazil in the hopes of recreating the kind of white supremacist social order that had prevailed in the antebellum South. He tells that story in fuller detail in yet another one of his books, The Global Mission of the Jim Crow South, which was published last year. I highly recommend that you check it out. It's an important story for scholars of religion in the Americas, and one, I think, that has enduring ramifications across the hemisphere today. If you've read this book, you know that many of its key insights spring not only from the archives, but also from his extensive ethnographic work in Brazuca communities. It's there, in the messiness of people's lives, that he discovers, and this is part that you talked about, a little bit about this in your presentation, but I want to sort of zoom in on what I find to be really exciting and really important. He discovers how and why, quote, an incipient immigrant theology has developed. In a riveting chapter entitled Wrestling, Chavez describes how pastors who once looked with suspicion on the undocumented, bringing with them a kind of moralistic sensibility, embarked on, quote, the life-changing journey of wrestling with the existential, theological, and ecclesiological implications of pastoring undocumented bodies in a context in which, quote-unquote, legality and quote-unquote morality cannot be assumed to be closely connected. Time and again, he finds that this journey produced changed hearts and minds. Even the most moralistic of ministers often developed along the way what Chavez calls in an elegant series of turns of phrase, quote, a theology of borderlessness, and, quote, an ecclesiology of the undocumented. Their official theological training didn't prepare them for the demands of ministry against the backdrop of an unjust immigration regime, but they benefited from the vital continuing education that was the encounter with the daily struggle of their parishioners. In some cases, Chavez finds, in a nod to the unmistakable power of the people in the pews, empathy for the undocumented became a kind of prerequisite for ordination in Brazuca contexts. Such trends underscore one of his most provocative and significant arguments, which he mentioned and puts this way early in the book. I think it's worth repeating. He says, quote, the paradox of the Brazilian Baptists is that, generally speaking, the closer they get to the SBC geographically, the further they get from them ideologically, in significant and demonstrable ways. So immigration politics represents one departure, obviously, and another that he mentioned is attitudes toward women's leadership. As he shows, Brazuca Baptist communities are more open to women's ordination than not only their white counterparts in the Southern Baptist Convention, but also their co-religionists back in Brazil. He attributes this to any number of factors, a major one of which is the greater receptivity to charismatic and Pentecostal currents in Brazuca circles. And here again, the dynamics surrounding migration are responsible, in his view, for a momentous change. Indeed, for the very possibility of something we might call, as he does, a Presby-Bapticostal. Whereas in Brazil, a harder line between Baptists and Pentecostals has endured, Brazuca communities have not had the luxury of investing in these divisions. Given the smaller pool of potential congregants and the transience of many Brazuca families, their churches have leaned into what Chavez calls, in another apt turn of phrase, quote, practical ecumenicity. In elaborating these different arguments, and there are so many arguments in this wonderful book, Chavez builds on the insights of path-breaking scholars such as Dan Ramirez, Daisy Machado, Arlene Sanchez-Walsh, Felipe Hinojosa, many more, even as he sheds new light on the particularities of Brazuca communities, which have been comparatively understudied to this point in time. As I was reading, I was reminded, too, of Bob Orsi's landmark book in my field, The Madonna of 115th Street, published some 38 years ago now. As Orsi underscored in that field-altering historical and ethnographic analysis of Italian Harlem, so Chavez shows in this book, immigrant communities are not merely reactive spaces, buffeted by larger social forces beyond their control. They are places of immense theological creativity and change, driven often not by church leaders as much as by everyday believers at the grassroots. While migrational religion involves some degree of transplantation of the old ways to a new world, it also entails the creation of something different and fundamentally new. And it's those two different dynamics that he's exploring at length in this book. He supports this contention by describing how Brazuca Baptists have invested in what he calls ethnic denominationalism, even as they have displayed considerable ambivalence toward the SBC, as he mentioned. They have historical and contemporary ties to this U.S. denomination, and yet are building churches in a wider social world that on any number of fronts sits awkwardly alongside white-dominated evangelical life in the United States. Many Brazuca believers are acutely aware of these tensions, with one pastor noting, he quotes, "When we try to work with them, namely the SBC, we have issues." As for the other side of the divide, Chavez writes at one point in the book, "What would be the Southern Baptist response to the reality that the commitment to missions and global justice work of immigrant churches is significantly supported by undocumented workers? Praise the Lord, but build the wall? One wonders." One wonders indeed. I found myself wondering, too, as I read the chapter on women's ordination, how sustainable this current Brazuca openness may be in a time in which the SBC is cracking down on even the likes of Rick Warren and Saddleback Church. I'd love to hear Chavez's reflections on what may be likely to happen there. Will being, quote, as he puts it, I think aptly, in but not of the SBC remain a viable position? Eager to know more, too, about how Brazuca churches are navigating these tumultuous times for democracy in the United States and around the world, Chavez alludes to some partisan divides within these communities toward the end of the book and discusses at some length their resistance to pan-ethnic forms of solidarity. On the latter front, he comments evocatively at one point about the ways that, quote, their imagination is often captured by intersecting white supremacist societies. This line brought to mind Benjamin Cowan's recent book, Moral Majorities Across the Americas, Brazil, the United States, and the Creation of the Religious Right. I know Chavez is working with colleagues, as mentioned this evening, including Raimundo Barreto and Erica Ramirez, on related themes. And I know I'm not alone in my eagerness to continue to learn more from this vitally important ongoing work with all of its important implications for how we think about the religious right, how we think about how we got here, and where we might be headed. There's so much more work to do on the ways that social class inflects Brazuca life, not to mention the ways that intergenerational collaboration and conflict might shape up in the years ahead. As the founding generation, this is a relatively new phenomenon in the US, as this founding generation passes the torch to younger folks. All of that work will be more doable, Joao, because of what you have achieved in this important book. I read it as beckoning us to explore Brazuca Baptist life in greater depth, to be sure, but also as an invitation to see the manifold ways that the complex, diverse, multifaceted religious worlds that we group together under the categorical umbrella of Christianity remain very much in motion, changing and evolving under myriad contemporary social pressures, and key, as a direct result of the seemingly boundless creativity and energy of immigrants and others who have too often been neglected in our stories. Thank you for bringing their contributions into the light of day. I have no doubt that migrational religion will continue to stimulate a wide variety of historical and theological discussions, including the one we'll have here in a moment. Grateful for your work, Joao. Excited to continue this and so many other important conversations with you in the years ahead. Congratulations on this well-deserved prize.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez, and thank you, Dr. Carter. Let's give all of our prize winners and respondents a big round of applause. So now we are going to open up for some questions, and we are going to ask that if you are interested in asking a question, that you please just stand where you are, and we will make sure that a microphone gets to you. So that you can go ahead and ask your questions. Who wants to be the first brave one?
So first, I would like to thank all of the presenters. It was wonderful. But my question is specifically for Dr. Delgado and Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano. I first want to thank you, Dr. Delgado, for sharing your grief with us. It is a gift that you didn't have to give us, but that I appreciate immensely, so thank you. And specifically thinking about grief and this phrase of hope that pierces hopelessness, and as a Puerto Rican myself, who is familiar with the context that you are both talking about, where do you see the role of grief in this search towards hope, or in this navigation of hopelessness? Because I think that often we don't open space for grief, and we don't allow that to be also something that can push us forward. And so, framed by what you were saying, Dr. Delgado, and seeing what Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano is presenting, I wonder what the role of grief you see is for this, specifically for Puerto Rico, and sort of this colonial constant grief that we have lived on for years and years and years. Sorry.
Gracias, Yolanda, por tu pregunta. So I think that so I don't use the word grief. I use the word lament, and at least in the book, the word lament, despair. And what I think about is the spaces that aren't there, and what happens when those spaces aren't there, which is lament and grief and despair is all consuming, and so it consumes all life. And so where I make the call there is for community to create spaces that hold you while you're able to redirect and find whatever it is that you're needing to find in order to move forward, whatever forward looks to you. And so Cole Arthur Riley says it best in This Here Flesh, when she says that our lament is only as deep as our hope, and our hope only as deep as our lament. And so she calls for those spaces where lament needs to happen, because otherwise, I'm paraphrasing, I actually took a picture of that quote because I figured I was going to use it today. But she talks about when we don't have those spaces, what happens is that you enter into un hueco within yourself, a hole within yourself. And so that becomes all consuming. And then also the danger is, being rushed into coming out of it. So I think that it's just the spaces that we learn to hold with each other, so we can do grief, wail as we need to, for as long as we need to, but knowing that everything else, then it's being taken care of, that you're being fed, that, like, literally fed, that somebody's bringing you meals, that that your hair is being, right, so all of these things that are being taken care of, and then there's still, and that it's also not just one direction of receiving that care, right, but there's a communication and a constant being in community, and knowing that you're held in the ways that you need to be held. Now that's sounds like really idyllic, but I say that because I've experienced what it looks like, right? So it's something that in different ways we can learn how to do with each other and for each other.
Thank you, Yara. That was actually the word that I was thinking of, Yolanda, as you asked that question, was lament. And I agree wholeheartedly with what you shared. I would add this, that, and this is something that I'm learning now, because I'm in the process of grieving, which is that there has been perhaps a misconception that somehow the stages of grief are linear, and that once you pass through them, you don't return to them. And I think perhaps what we can offer as theologians to that misconception as a corrective is how our own liturgical calendars return to grief all the time. And the powerful memory, the memorializing of grief, in order to not forget that pain, not so that one is immersed in it and you fall into that hole but that you don't lose sight of the power that can be generated from that grief to make a change in one's life
in the community and in the world. Because then you know, why is it so important? Why does it matter what we do? Because of the pain that we have suffered and that we continue to suffer. So I think that there is, maybe this is me as a Catholic, right? I carry the rosary all the time. And we see the crucifix all the time in our liturgical spaces, and we're not quick to dismiss that. I think that that's helpful as long as we maintain that balance of not becoming so lost in that grief that we don't see the ways in which our own community, along with our community, we can work through it. I hope that answers your question, Yolanda.
Thank you all for your beautiful presentations. Is this on? Dr. Gonzalez Justiano, you have painted a beautiful vision for what hope can look like even in the darkest times. Dr. Delgado, could you share with us the very last quote that you had shared at the end of your presentation again? It really resonated with me. It was the very last line that you had read.
So it's in the book,
Yes.
on right after the acknowledgments on Roman numeral 13. Hope is knowing that reality is not the exhaustion of all possibilities.
Thank you. So this actually brings a question that some of us HTI scholars were actually discussing this week in Visions of Hope. And I wanted to see how you would position your vision of hope in relationship to other visions such as Miguel de la Torres's Embracing Hopelessness, and where how you process and relate to those types of understandings.
That's in chapter 2.